Pastor Paul Mackenzie drew his beliefs from the radical teachings of the Latter Rain movement, the same ideology that captivated Jim Jones before the Jonestown tragedy. Jonestown is known for one of the largest mass deaths. And to give a brief summary in case you don't know, Jim Jones was the leader of a cult and his congregation, the People's Temple. It was located in South America, where he instructed followers to kill themselves by ingesting Valium, chloral hydrate, cyanide, and Phenergan that was mixed into flavor aid, which also inspired the phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid. 909 people died in Jonestown. This extreme doctrine preached the idea of unlocking atomic power through fasting. It's inspired by Franklin Hall's book, Atomic Power with God Through Fasting and Prayer. Paul Mackenzie taught his followers that true salvation could only be reached by starving themselves. He promised his followers protection from the coming apocalypse. But instead of finding peace, hundreds of his followers would end up losing their lives. Today, we are diving into one of the world's worst cult-related massacres, the Shakahola Forest Massacre. I'd like to give a trigger warning before we dive in. This episode discusses disturbing topics including religious extremism, abuse, self-exiting, starvation, mass death, and SA. Listener discretion is advised, as these topics may be distressing. Please take care while listening. And just a quick disclaimer, this trial is still ongoing and Paul Mackenzie has not been yet convicted. All things stated are alleged and you are innocent until proven guilty. I do also feel the need to add that this case is highly complex and contains a lot of conflicting information. I've done my best to base this episode on the most reliable sources available, but I encourage you to dig deeper and do your own research to form your own understanding of what happened. Cases like this involve many perspectives and layers and complex details that can make it hard to know the full truth. I encourage you to keep an open mind and a critical eye, to consider different sources and viewpoints rather than taking any single version of events as the absolute truth. With that being said, grab your favorite cup, get ready, and remember, once we start brewing, the truth can't be unsipped. Paul Mackenzie, also known as P.N. Mackenzie, who is now in his 50s, is married with 7 children. He grew up in a family of 12 with Protestant parents in Kuala County. Robert Mackenzie, Paul's younger brother, stated Paul did not have any theological training. Before becoming a servant, Paul was a former street vendor and cab driver with a high school education. He apprenticed with a teacher in Malindi in the late 1990s. Then Paul would go on to open his own church, the Good News International Ministries, as a small evangelical center in August of 2003, which was also located in Malindi. And just a quick little note, the Good News International Ministries, from now on, I'll be referring to as GNIM. With GNIM, he was able to convince several people to follow him by claiming that he could speak directly with God, and he is referred to on their website as Servant of God P.N. Mackenzie. The GNIM website claims to have various branches around Kenya, such as Nairobi, Watamu, Malindi, Mombasa, and many more, with a growing congregation of more than 3,000 throughout all the branches. It also states the mission of the ministry is to nurture the faithful holistically in all matters of Christian spirituality, as we prepare for the second coming of Jesus Christ through teaching and evangelism. The servant of God, Paul N. Mackenzie, has reached many souls and undoubtedly transforming lives with the gospel of truth as guided by the Holy Spirit. The GNIM had a gospel program that aired every day, called end time messages. Oftentimes, Paul would have a series of exorcism, which were mostly women. They would flail around on the ground while he torments the demonic forces within them. In 2018, the Kenya Film Classification Board ordered the immediate closure of the TV station. So, what exactly did the starvation cult leader preach? His teachings focused heavily on doomsday warnings and were strongly anti-Western. It's reported he predicted the world would end on April 15, 2023. He condemned things such as medical care, education, food, sports, music, and what he called the uselessness of life. In a song called The Antichrist, he labeled the Catholic Church, the United States, and the United Nations as tools of Satan. Many of his teachings are still on YouTube, where he delivers passionate sermons in a very raspy voice.
Kama kuna mtu ameniita kati yenu, basi atanitisha mimi. Kama kuna mtu ambaye anajua nilitoka wapi.
He repeatedly references New World Order, which is a conspiracy theory or a belief about a plot by global elites to bring an authoritarian world government, replacing nation states, claiming the Catholic Church, the UN, and the US are behind it. He would tell his congregation education is evil and that it's a sin. It's satanic and used to extort money. A few of his quotes read, "They know education is evil, but they use it for their own gains," he says in one sermon. Those who sell uniforms, write books, those who make pens, all kinds of rubbish. They use your money to enrich themselves while you become poor. He would also tell the Nation newspaper, "I told people education is evil. Children are taught gayism and lesbianism." And according to Paul Mackenzie, doctors serve a different God. Therefore, mothers were encouraged to avoid seeking medical attention during childbirth and not to vaccinate children. He would also discourage women from wearing makeup, wigs, extensions, or having long hair or nails, and even plaiting their hair. As Paul's influence increased, other pastors and leaders began to raise concerns about his teachings. He first drew government attention for opposing formal education and vaccinations. In March of 2017, Mackenzie and his late wife, Joyce, were charged with promoting radicalization, promoting extreme beliefs, and failing to provide children with education. But they were discharged by the trial court in order to be of good behavior. In October of 2017, Paul was arrested again and charged with radicalization and offering education in an unauthorized institution in Malindi, but he was acquitted in October 2021. It's unclear exactly when, but at some point, Paul acquired a TV station after one of his followers sold their property at the price of 20 million Kenya shillings, which would be approximately 154,000 US dollars, and handed over all the money to him. The property had been valued at over 100 million back then. And then the follower died 2 months later under very mysterious circumstances. He was arrested in April 2019 and charged with 3 counts: incitement to disobedience of the law, possession and distribution of unauthorized films, and operating a film studio without a valid license. And he was charged with incitement and disobedience of the law because he was very vocal about the digital IDs that had microchips being the mark of the beast. He was very vocal about it either on his show or on YouTube, possibly both, but he does still have a post about it on his website. A few sentences from his post state, "Some people who have been following the end times messages have been asking, is this 666 mark of the beast? Brethren, I want to tell you this is just the beginning of the mark. It may not be openly seen as the mark as of now, but we may not know what the world leaders are planning. Ask yourself, how are these IDs going to guarantee security? So my brother and sister in the Lord, it is time to put our past straight and be ready for the second coming of our Lord Jesus." In 2019, he then closed his church in Malindi and urged followers to join him in Shakahola, where he leased 800 acres of forest land, a remote scrubland in southeast Kenya, approximately 100 kilometers or 62 miles from Malindi. Shakahola Forest is a dense, sprawling landscape filled with thick brush and winding paths that seem to disappear in the wild. The forest is known for its heavy humidity, with the air often feeling thick and damp, especially after rain showers that leave the ground muddy and slippery. It's a place where elephants, big cats, camels, giraffes, and zebras roam freely. The silence is often interrupted by the calls of birds and distant rustling, giving it an eerie, untouched feel. He lured followers in by offering cheap and affordable land, selling parcels for less than $100. He manipulated gullible followers to dispose of their earthly possessions and promised a serene life in Shakahola as they prepared for the end of the world in August 2023. So I guess he ended up predicting a second doomsday besides April. The influx of followers intensified during COVID. He exploited people's vulnerabilities and recruited hundreds of followers from across the country. It's also been reported that his wife was a crucial part in recruiting members as well. After people handed over their life earnings, Paul and his team would then persuade members to destroy any and all vital documents, such as passports, national identification cards, marriage certificates, academic documents, birth certificates, and title deeds. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Before I get in too deep, I wanted to explain what the KNCHR does and is because I'll refer to them several times in this case. The Commission is an independent national human rights institution. The Commission plays two key mandates. One, it acts as a watchdog over the government in the area of human rights. Two, provides key leadership in moving the country towards a human right state. The main goal is to investigate and provide redress for human rights violations, to research and monitor the compliance of human rights norms and standards, to conduct human rights education, to facilitate training, campaigns, and advocacy on human rights, as well as collaborate with other stakeholders in Kenya. Now back to the story. The commission report states he intentionally isolated his followers from their relatives and the rest of society by confining them in the desolate Shakahola wilderness, which had no phone service, transport infrastructure, or any social services such as schools or hospitals. One survivor stated they would pay a small fee to own plots. They were required to build houses and live in villages with biblical names such as Nazareth. And now with all these members in the desolate forest, now that no one has the resources to seek any assistance, Paul was able to put his beliefs into action, convincing his followers to follow a strict fasting plan that he claimed would lead them to heaven. According to a macabre order drawn up by Paul, children should be the first to go, then the unmarried, then the women, then the men. And at the very, very last, the church leaders, including Paul. He declared himself the prophetic pawpaw, and he had set himself up in a house with solar panels, which was known as ikulu, which is Swahili for palace. The house exterior and interior walls looked to be made of mud with a grass-thatched roof. Upon entering the home, Paul had a kitchen and, not to mention, a weekly menu. On Monday, for breakfast, he wrote bread and boga. For supper, it reads nil. Tuesday, sima boga for breakfast and porridge for dinner. Wednesday, spaghetti and porridge. It doesn't seem like Paul was planning to skip any meals from the looks of his menu and a refrigerator stocked with milk and bread. When you go out to the back side of his house, there is a pool of water. perhaps to keep the cult leader hydrated. Meanwhile, the follower shelters are what one might consider deplorable conditions. Some lived in makeshift shelters that resemble a very natural looking tent, with branches holding up a thin black tarp that looks to be the same material and weight of a trash bag. The bed is a mat, a very thin one with little to no padding. Paul recruited a group of armed militia who acted as his bodyguards and informers, and they were both men and women. It came to light that the bodyguards played a key role at the death camp. They would make sure no one would change their mind or leave the forest. They would also supervise and enforce the fasting and the deaths that followed. Those who defied the order to fast were either strangled or clobbered to death by the militia. In accounts told by survivors and former cult members, runaways were stopped. The group of male enforcers bearing machetes chased, beat, and dragged them back to the forest. While waiting for people to die, they would start digging shallow graves. Once members succumbed to starvation, the guards would bury them. It's believed they walked around camp with shovels and would start digging when they found the deceased. Sometimes they wouldn't even wait for them to die. When they were frail, they would just go ahead and murder them, just to save some time. Instead of having to come back around, they would just kill them and bury them right then. The graves were shallow and also very organized. When you hear the word mass graves, one might imagine a large hole with disorganized remains. But these were organized. Although some graves had up to 10 bodies, most were found to have around 5 or 6 people, and they would be laid side by side. One survivor who was able to escape the death camp says that she lost faith in Pastor Paul once she saw how his bodyguards handled people on the verge of death from starvation. The team would simply whisk away the person, never to be seen again. They would rape women in the villages like a routine. She would also reveal that she was sexually assaulted by 4 men while pregnant with her first child. A 17-year-old survivor gave her testimony about being removed from school and her life in the cult. In her testimony, she recounts that her mother withdrew her from school in 4th grade in 2020 without her father's consent. In her words, "I remember the day my mother picked me up from school. It was on a Friday. She brought me to Mombasa and we attended the church at one of Paul's branches. In October, they were told about land available in Shakahola. She states her mother bought 2 acres and they relocated to Shakahola. Her mother sold all their belongings except a mattress and some utensils. When they arrived, they settled in the village, where they lived in tents before moving to temporary structures. They were assigned land by Paul's guards. The 17-year-old girl was among one of those selected by Paul to spread his message door to door, which I'm more than positive that this was a recruiting tactic. She also states there was no church in the forest. Meetings were held in a village called Judea. Paul referred to the fasting as express lockdown. She says she witnessed the deaths of 6 children from their village. The deaths were announced in Saturday meetings as a way to motivate others to fast and ascend to their deaths. She had to steal water to drink whenever her mother left the house. This minor was forced to starve for 38 days before authorities intervened. There had been several cases of followers selling their properties and giving Paul the funds. Many of the followers were leaving behind everything, including family members. One of the most well-known, Betty. She was a flight attendant, and she had quit her job of 11 years at Qatar Airways. She sold all of her lifelong investments of allegedly 7 million Kenya shilling. It's reported Betty's son allegedly died while fasting with his grandparents while she was away working. She was devastated by the news. She returned to Kenya for the burial and disappeared soon after. She packed up her remaining kids and left a note for her husband stating, "I'm so sorry to have left, but maybe this was our destiny. Thanks for everything you have done for us in this time while we were together. Take care of yourself. I hope we meet each other someday. I'm really emotional writing this, but know I loved you with every bit in me. It is really hard for me, but I have to go. Have a lovely life and always know we watching from above. You know, one day we all gonna be history. Goodbye." Selema Masha tells her story. She states, "At first, the pastor dug water wells in the forest and told members to wait for Jesus. And they waited. But then suddenly, he told them they should fast and go to heaven. After 7 days of fasting, she says she heard a voice from God telling her this wasn't his will and that she still had work to do in the world. So she stopped. She attended a funeral of 8 children and it was called Going to Sleep. She was told if her children won't die, she should stop attending other people's funerals. In her words, she explains, when the child cries or asks for food or water, we were told to take a cane and beat them so that they could go and eat in heaven. So I thought about it and I said, I cannot go on with this situation. I can't eat while my child is starving. I told myself, if I feel this bad when I fast, how about my child?" When members questioned the order, as Selema did, they were told that if they delayed their deaths, heaven would be full. The gates closed, time is up. Selema had discovered that her husband was one of Mackenzie's deputies. He was involved in managing it. A friend told her that when he went to work, he was actually going to bury the dead. One day in March, he put his foot down, forcing the family to fast. 4 days later, he left for work and Selema saw her opportunity. She grabbed the children and left. She says, "My children fasted for 4 days without food and water and they were crying. So when I saw they were so weak, I gave them water and I told myself I couldn't allow my children to die." The children were guided by the determination of their mother and protected by her status as the wife of Paul's aide. Selema says she was challenged by other cult members, but not stopped. And when she reached the main road after walking for several kilometers, she was able to get a lift from a Good Samaritan to a safe place. She says Paul's bodyguards came looking for her a week after she left and advised her return, but they didn't threaten her. But she knows others were not treated as kindly. A woman came to her asking for help to escape the cult with their children and find the money for transport back to their home village. Selema promised she would do so. The woman went back to the forest to get her children and was never heard from again. A police report states the cops received a tip about, this is their words, by the way, ignorant citizens starving to death under the pretext of meeting Jesus after being brainwashed by suspect Paul Mackenzie, a pastor of Good News International Church. That tip to the police came on Tuesday, March 21st, 2023, from Francis, a 59-year-old high school teacher from Mombasa and a concerned grandfather. He had heard that his daughter and her family may have moved to the forest and went to investigate. Sadly, he was too late to rescue some of his grandchildren, but he did find his 9-year-old grandson. Francis states, "He told me he saw his siblings die. He saw them being starved by their parents, and that is a story he will never forget. He will never forget. He knew he would be next, but he was lucky he was rescued." Pastor Paul Mackenzie was arrested on Wednesday evening, March 22nd, 2023, after a Malindi court ordered the exhumation of minors' bodies. The children's parents were also listed as suspects. On March 23rd, 2023, the prosecution team requested Paul to be held for 14 days for being connected to the murder of 2 children found in shallow graves and to have died from starvation and suffocation. And those 2 children that they found were France's other grandchildren. And the courts declined the request for a lack of evidence. They released Paul on a cash bail of 10,000 Kenya shillings and ordered him to report to the police station as and when required to do so. April 17th, Paul Mackenzie, the cult leader, had been arrested along with 13 others. The prosecution requested to hold them for 30 days for being connected to the offenses of murder, suicide, manslaughter, conspiracy to kill, criminal recklessness, and negligence, abducting in order to confine, accessories to the fact, child cruelty, child neglect, attempted suicide. The court ordered Paul to stay in police custody for 14 days. On April 25th, 2023, 1 month after the media first reported on the mass graves, the government launched a search and rescue mission alongside efforts to locate and exhume bodies from the graves. By the end of this operation, which continued from April to October 2023, authorities had exhumed 429 bodies and rescued 67 adults and 25 children. 65 of the survivors were rescued from Shakahola and taken to a rescue center in Kilifi County. However, they refused to eat. On June 10th, 2023, they were brought to court where the prosecution requested they be moved to prison for mental and medical assessments and to be forced to eat. The court postponed its decision to June 15th, but the 65 survivors were transferred to a men and women's prison in the meantime, without any charges against them. These survivors still following practices shaped by deep indoctrination. They were held like criminals rather than receiving the psychological support needed to help them recover and de-radicalize. On June 15th, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights advised the courts, hey, you should probably consider referring the victims to psychological support and mental assessments instead of keeping them in prisons. After the commission's advice, the courts decided to return the survivors back to the original rescue center and provided them with a psychologist to assist with their mental health. It's also worth mentioning that one of the suspects were discharged and placed under witness protection. On July 31st, 2023, 41 of the survivors had been sent to pretrial detention after the public prosecutors determined they were suspects for multiple crimes. And this is a paragraph, but you have to remember it's among 41 people, so it's bound to be long. The crimes include attempted murder, manslaughter, manslaughter by suicide pacts, aiding suicide, grievous harm to another person, including minors, radicalization, cruelty, and neglect of children, as well as failure to provide minors with necessaries without lawful excuse, failure by parents to take child to school, and failure to give notice of death, and burying without a burial permit. Those 41 were detained at the prison. The other 24 were returned to the rescue center. But the remaining 24 had been transferred back to prison since the prosecutors saw them as suspects for similar offenses on August 23rd. Remember earlier in the case, we had talked about Paul being arrested in April of 2019. Well, on December 1st, 2023, him and his co-accused were found guilty and sentenced to 1 year in prison for incitement to disobedience of the law, possession and distribution of unauthorized films, and operating a film studio without a valid license. You often see this in the US. The police will try to get a suspect on a different charge in order to keep them in jail. Sometimes it's so that they can try to get more evidence and build a strong case. Maybe other times the suspect is seen as dangerous and they don't want them out in the public where they may cause more harm. On January 14th, 2024, the courts made a ruling where they gave the state 2 weeks to charge Paul Mackenzie and all of the persons being held in relation to Shakahola, or the court would release them on bail or bond terms. which led to a flurry of charges being brought against the suspects. So on January 17th, Paul and his co-suspects were presented before the Malindi High Court to face 191 counts of murder charges of the minors. The plea taking was deferred to 14 days pending mental assessment of the suspects. The accused persons took plea, but one of the accused persons was found to be mentally unstable, according to medical reports. On January 31st, the Cabinet Secretary for Interior and National Coordination issued a notice declaring Pastor Paul Mackenzie's Good News International Ministries an organized criminal group. As of now, over 600 people are reported to be missing, while more than 429 bodies have been recovered. Autopsy reports revealed that the main causes of death were starvation, asphyxia, head injury, and dehydration. The autopsy reports are consistent with narratives from the survivors and witnesses on what happened in that forest. The commission report states their lives were taken away in the most egregious and ghastly manner, violating their right to life. An inquiry by the Kenya Commission of Human Rights was prompted. The findings revealed that the public officials were aware of Paul Mackenzie's purported illegal activities. Their report states the negligence and failure of the judicial system, which released Paul several times or failed to expedite hearings against him, and the national security and administration structures left Paul's followers in the full control and mercy of Paul Mackenzie and his militia. Many followers faced a slow, excruciating death, mainly through starvation. Paul Mackenzie, somehow, he's still maintaining his innocence. His mother, Anastasia, defends her son against all allegations. According to her, the police are trying to frame him, and he stopped preaching back when he closed his church in 2019. In her words, she says, "I am his mother. Has he tried to kill me? My son is innocent, and what they are doing to him is unfair. I have never seen my son with any issue. They are trying to frame him and arrest him." According to Paul's younger brother, Robert, Paul did not have any theological training. He says he saw his brother try ministering at different churches, but differences between Paul and other churches proved to be too much, and he was kicked out of 3 churches before creating his own. He says Paul told them his God-ordered mission had ended in 2019 and that he was settling down to farm in the fields. Regardless of the number of bodies found in the fields and the stories of the survivors, they are convinced that Paul is the target of malice. They say growing up he was kind to a fault and just completely incapable of the crimes he's being accused for. Which I have to say, I'm sure as a mother, or really anybody, if you have a family member, a brother, like I could imagine my brother being a cult leader. But there are so many survivors. There are so many statements from all these people. I mean, the 429 bodies. It is mind-blowing to me that they are just like, no, he's being framed. It's not his fault because he didn't have theological training. And how traumatizing for survivors, victims to hear that. I mean, I don't expect them. I don't know that they should apologize on his behalf. It's not what I'm saying. It's just to be so publicly outspoken about his innocence is pretty freaking insane. And before this next segment, I do want to state I highly recommend doing your own research to gather the full extent of the story. But I do think it's also important to do my best to inform you about the history of Shakahola Forest. The locals are trying to bring to attention that this is the world's first time hearing about Shakahola, and it's being associated with the cult massacre. And now it's overshadowing the fact that this exact same place is sacred ground. Megatalili was deeply loved by her community. Her heart was filled with immense love for her people, and she was always ready to protect them. She was a revered Kenya freedom fighter from the Giriama community. Born around the mid-19th century, she led a significant resistance against British colonial rule in the early 1900s. Known for her fierce dedication to her people and her cultural traditions, she opposed British-imposed practices like forced labor, land seizures, and taxation of the local communities. Mekatilili Wamenza became famous for organizing her people to resist colonial rule and for promoting traditional Giriama practices, including rallying the community through traditional dances and cultural gatherings. Her connection to Shakahola Forest, where the recent events tied to the cult occurred, is more symbolic than direct. Shakahola is located in Kilifi County, part of the coastal region where the Giriama people, Mekatilili's community, live. Her legacy is one of liberation and empowerment for her people, and in many ways, her historical importance contrasts starkly with a modern-day tragedy in Shakahola. The forest has sadly become associated with the controversial practices of Mackenzie's cult. This tragedy highlights a painful divergence from her legacy, which was about preservation and empowerment, rather than suffering. Today, Mekatilili Wamenza's memory is honored as a symbol of resistance and empowerment in Kenya, serving as an inspirational figure for those opposing oppression and advocating for cultural pride and resilience. Now, I want to talk more about the psychology. When we look at the psychology of cult leaders, certain traits stand out. Leaders like Paul Mackenzie often have a strong charisma that draws people in, making them feel understood and safe. They use this influence to gain control, tapping into people's deepest fears and hopes. For his followers, he offered a sense of purpose and the promise of salvation, but it came at a heavy price. Paul didn't just preach. He isolated his followers, creating a world where his word was the only truth. This is a common tactic among cult leaders, separating people from friends, family, and society, so they depend solely on him. It's a kind of psychological grip that can be hard to break, even as situations become more extreme. And while we might wonder why followers stayed, it's important to remember that they were victims. They were people searching for hope, purpose, belonging, possibly even comfort somehow. And instead, they found tragedy. As we close this episode, it's difficult to fully comprehend the depth of what happened in Shakahola. The tragedy of the lost lives of followers who placed their faith in a leader only to suffer unimaginable consequences. It leaves a heavy weight on our hearts. This case is a haunting reminder of the powerful role belief and vulnerability play in shaping our lives, and how sometimes that trust can be devastatingly misplaced. For the families affected, healing may feel out of reach. It's also a reminder of our responsibility to be vigilant, to ask hard questions, and to stand with those who seek the truth. Because in sharing these stories, we're not just exploring the dark side of humanity. We're trying to honor the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. May we continue to remember their names, their lives, and more importantly, their stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, as always, take care of each other and yourselves. I'll see you next week.